Well, hi, everybody. Happy New Year. I hope this year is a little bit more promising than last year, although early indications may not seem that way. I'm sure we're going to have a good year. So welcome wherever you are, and I look forward to working with you just for 30 minutes, just on the ingredients of effective feedback, which I think is something that's very, very important. How do we actually improve our capacity to give good feedback to people and minimize defensiveness and give people an opportunity to take in the message that we want them to have? So I'll share my slides and we'll get stuck into it and have a look at some of these characteristics that I'm talking about. Okay, so a little bit about me to start with. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author. I've written 13 books, and one of the books that the information today comes out of is Mastering Feedback, which will be out in a couple of months' time. I also keynote speak at various conferences, although that's been curtailed somewhat over the last 12 months. I'm an executive coach, run workshops, and as you can see up in the top left-hand corner, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. And of course, people might think that's crazy, and we only play once every 2 weeks because at my age, it takes 2 weeks to recover. All right, let's get stuck into the topic. Now, the big objection that a lot of people have around the notion of giving constructive feedback, I think, is how do I minimize friction when I'm giving constructive feedback? Because obviously there's a risk, isn't there? When you're giving constructive feedback, there's no guarantee that the other person, that is the person that you're giving the feedback to, will actually take it in the right vein. In other words, not get defensive about it. And I'm talking about constructive feedback here more than talking about positive feedback, because usually that's where these things come undone. So what I want to do is address that question today and give you a couple of tips on minimizing that. In other words, there's no guarantee that the other person won't accept the feedback in the right vein. In fact, that is completely the other person's responsibility. In other words, it's not our responsibility to try and anticipate how the other person might receive the feedback. Our responsibility is to make sure that we give the feedback in the right way so that we can minimize the potential for perhaps friction that might occur from that. So there's 3 things that I want to cover today. I want to look at the whole notion of feedback and engagement and share a little bit of research with you on that. And next week, I have another webinar which actually talks directly about the topic of feedback and engagement. I obviously want to cover the ingredients of effective feedback because that's the title of the webinar today. And at the end of this, I have a special offer that I'm going to share with you for you to participate, for you participating. So let's launch into the topic and look at this. Now, the graph I'm showing you at the moment is a very interesting graph because we have research that demonstrates that there's a high correlation between engagement and feedback. So the short message is, if you want your people to be more engaged, and who doesn't, then we must indulge in more feedback, both positive and constructive. And this graph really does illustrate that point very clearly. You can see that up the top, if your team members, for example, only ever received positive feedback, so you were prepared to give people praise and positive feedback on a regular basis, there's no doubt that that would lead to higher levels of engagement. And the blue or the green color there shows engagement levels. So the easiest way to engage people is really to give them positive feedback. But now it gets a little bit interesting, because on the second graph there, you can see that if you only ever received critical or constructive feedback, as I call it, in other words, you were prepared to pull people up and explain the shortcomings of the work they did and did it in a respectful way, you're still likely to have a reasonable level of engagement in your team. Now, obviously, there are a few other variables. I mean, the degree to which people trust you, the way you actually give the feedback, what you give the feedback on. Of course, there are a whole lot of other factors involved in that. But the bottom line is, if you're doing those things in the right way and you are respected, it will lead to higher levels of engagement, because fundamentally human beings want to know where the line in the sand is. They actually want feedback. Survey after survey demonstrates that people want more feedback from their manager. Now, the interesting thing is the bottom bar. If you and I don't give much or any feedback at all, then that's a surefire way we're going to end up with disengagement from an employee perspective. So in other words, no feedback will lead to disengagement, regardless of whether it's positive feedback or constructive feedback. So the message is very clear. And as I indicated earlier, I've got a webinar on this next Friday at the same time, and I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth about the relationship between engagement and feedback. So let's launch into some of the ingredients that are important around feedback. I think one of the key ingredients of feedback, and this is one that's often underestimated, is timing. If the sooner after the event or the critical incident that you give feedback, the more likely it is that the person receiving that feedback will take that message on board. And there's a very simple reason why. So, for example, if somebody is dealing with a customer and they get upset on the phone or via video link or whatever it is, and you overhear that and you decide to give them feedback immediately after the call, that's going to be effective, because what you've actually done is you have signified to the other person that you think this is important. Because if you didn't think it was important, of course, you would have either delayed giving the feedback or not given it at all. So it means that what that means for us as leaders, we've got to down tools and give feedback as soon after the event as possible. And then it sends a very clear signal to the receiver that this is a priority for you, and therefore implicitly it should be a priority for them. So that's really important. I often find that leaders say to me, well, it's Friday afternoon and people are tired. I'll leave talking to so-and-so until Monday morning. And then Monday morning turns up and there's a meeting. And then perhaps Tuesday arrives and there's another meeting. And then maybe we get to Wednesday and we think to ourselves, oh, well, it's too late now. It's gone. Let sleeping dogs lie. I won't bother opening up this can of worms. So timing is really important. And what that means is that you've got to find the time to give the feedback and to do it as soon after the event as possible. So for example, if you're in a meeting and somebody says something that's derogatory or perhaps sexist or racist or something in the meeting, then your best window of opportunity is immediately after the meeting. So by doing that, you're signifying to the other person that this is important, and that's why I'm giving you this feedback. The second important criteria or ingredient of feedback is you need to make sure that the feedback is very specific and not generalized. Because if you generalize, then the message will be either lost or people will take it personally. That requires you to think very carefully about the words that you use when you give the feedback. And if you don't do that right, you don't usually get a second chance. So if you mess that up, it's likely that the person will become defensive and you won't have got your message across. Let me show you what I mean. Can you imagine if you said this to somebody? So here's your feedback. You say to somebody, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now, if you give someone that feedback, then obviously what they're going to think about is, what did I do wrong? Because they're just going to fixate on that last sentence, but it could have been better. It's far too general and it's not helpful, and it's not likely to lead to any positive behaviour change for the simple reason that the other person doesn't know what they need to do differently. This is a better approach. Imagine if you said this: great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment, maybe for next time, you could invite more comments from the group and get them more involved. Now that's far better feedback because you have given them the specifics of why you like the presentation. That is the fact that they use statistics. You've also given them a helpful hint around the notion of getting the group more involved. Now, in most cases, if you gave that feedback to a participant, somebody who was presenting in a meeting, they're probably likely to say something or respond something along the lines of, yes, I was very nervous and I realised I probably should have got people more involved and I probably should have fielded more questions, but I didn't. So you're actually getting some degree of alignment or empathy or rapport with the person with that second approach. So the second approach is you need to be very specific about what you're giving feedback about. Now, the third element of this is that you need to be giving feedback on a regular basis. It's not a one-off situation. And I strongly urge my clients who I coach to be looking for opportunities to give 3 bits of feedback every single day. Whether it's positive or constructive is not as important as whether we do it. And I think you just need to get into the habit of actually giving regular feedback. And the only way to do that is to set yourself a little task and say that I'm going to do this on a regular basis. And every single day, I'm going to find 3 opportunities to do this. And I think if you do that, it's likely that you'll find those opportunities. And once you've found those opportunities, it's then important to pounce on them. In other words, being timely and then being very specific about the feedback that you want to give that person. So frequency is critical. So when you go back to that graph that I went through before, you'll note that those sorts of effects that feedback has or doesn't have very much relates to the frequency of the feedback. The other thing I'd suggest is that another principle or ingredient is that you should be asking questions. So I don't see feedback as you sitting down with someone and articulating a position. I do see it as a conversation, and a very, very important conversation. So in other words, I want that person to have skin in the game. I want them to be engaged with me in a conversation around feedback. And the only way I can really do that or ensure that I can do that is by asking open-ended questions. What, when, who, where, how, and which. If you ask any question starting with those words, you're going to get more than a yes or no. So what went wrong? How do you mean? When did it take place? What happened? So by doing that, you are engaging the other person in the process of feedback itself. And I think this is a big mistake that leaders make. They put all the energy into expressing their own perspective, which you're quite within your rights to express, but then failing to actually get the other person engaged in the process. The more engaged the other person is, the more likely it is that they're going to take on board what you suggest. Now, there is a school of thought that suggests that we should praise in public and criticize in private. I'm not a person who believes that. I find that people can be quite uncomfortable with public praise. You know, if you think about introverts in your workplace, not everyone wants attention drawn to them. And I sometimes think that managers give public praise not so much because, they think it's the right thing, but so they can be seen to be doing the right thing. So my view is, rule of thumb, wherever possible, you praise in private, and you pray, and if you've got something negative to say, you do that in private as well. It will have just as, if not a better effect, when it's done in private. You're respecting the rights of the other person. Now, some people say to me, well, what about if it's the full team and you're giving team feedback? Well, absolutely. Obviously, if you've got 6 people in your team and you're happy with the way they've been performing, then obviously it would be perfectly reasonable for you to make a comment in a team meeting and to give some feedback about the team's performance. Or indeed, if the team's performance was negative, that would be okay. But I think when it comes to one-on-one situations, I don't know what you think, but I think it can sometimes fall flat if we don't give that feedback privately. And I think whenever we're giving feedback, what we should be looking for is critical incidents. In other words, we're looking for examples where we can anchor the feedback. And normally this isn't difficult, because usually an incident might occur at work, and all of a sudden you can then jump in and say to them, looking at that situation, and therefore you're actually using that critical incident to give the feedback. So I think it's extremely important that you have examples that you can share with people that illustrate why you're giving that feedback, both positive and negative. And I think sometimes, if you don't do that, it becomes too general and people become confused and they don't know what you're actually referring to. So use critical incidents wherever possible. And critical incidents are very, very powerful and can be used to great benefit. The other thing I'd say about feedback that I think is extremely important is, remember that the only reason that you and I give feedback is to change the future. So if we, for example, are giving constructive feedback, what we're wanting to do ultimately is modify or change the behavior of the other person in the future. In other words, we want them not to do what they're doing, or to perhaps do what they should be doing. It's all about the future. Now, if we're giving positive feedback, it's all about the future as well. So if I give positive feedback to somebody, what I'm doing is I'm hopefully reinforcing that behavior in the future. So what I'm doing is I want that person to continue that behavior. So you see, it's all about the future. And I think this is important because I quite often see managers wallowing around in the past. And, certainly you need to understand the situation, and complex situations require you to understand by asking questions what happened. But at the end of the day, the feedback is all about the future. And I think you need to gently or firmly steer the conversation around what has to happen as a result of the feedback, whether it is to continue that behavior or perhaps to modify that behavior. And I think sometimes we forget to do that. Now, a couple of things when you're dealing with people in difficult conversations. I don't think many of us enjoy it when we have to sit down and performance manage someone. It's not easy. And a couple of principles or ingredients that I think are really important for you to keep in mind. The first thing that's important is to avoid confrontation and argument. Now, when you're sitting down with someone, giving somebody some constructive feedback and they want to argue with you, you will gain nothing by arguing back. So if you do that, you're going to create a problem for yourself. So there's two simple ways of going about that. The first thing you can do is say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. And if you say that to somebody, then of course, they're really shadowboxing because there's no way that they can argue with you about it. On the other hand, you might say to someone, let's agree to disagree. So on a relatively minor issue, when you're giving this feedback, just agree to disagree. And then what you've done is you've neutralized that, and you could move to the more substantive issues involved in the feedback. So the rule here is no arguing and no confrontation. It's not about that. It should be a conversation between two people to rectify certain performance behavior. Secondly, I think it's critically important to focus on the performance. Now, what I mean by that is you need to be very specific about what it is that you're giving the feedback about. Now, let's say that there are several things that that person's not doing well in their job. I do not think it's sensible for you to sit down and go through those several things in that one conversation. Select the one which is the most critical and just talk about that, because it becomes too overwhelming. And what happens is the other person will likely get very defensive about it, and that's not going to be helpful for anybody. So focus on the person's performance, talk about the critical incident, and then talk about how it can be rectified in the future. As I said earlier, it's all about the future. So therefore, try to move the person on to what has to happen in the future. Now, in these cases that I'm talking about, we're talking about behavior change. We're talking about convincing the other person to change their behavior in the future. So that needs to be where the energy is. It's not around, apportioning blame or getting too deeply involved in the detail of the issue. Really, the purpose of the meeting is to change the behavior for the future. And you should actually say that in the meeting if you need to. So focus very much on the future. The other thing I'd say is to very much to emphasize strengths as well as weaknesses. And I guess what I'm alluding to there is, now I'm not suggesting you sugarcoat things, because I don't see any value in you doing that. I think it's far better for you to, perhaps end on a note of positivity. And the very least that you can do in those conversations is to say to the other person, I'm very confident that this behavior can change. Because let's face it, if you weren't confident that behavior could change, then why are you giving the feedback? So ultimately, it's all about showing and demonstrating some confidence that the other person can modify their behavior as a result of that. And finally, if it is a complex situation, and many of these things are, it's a good idea then to seek out the causes. Ask the person, why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. Find out the root cause of the problems is a useful way of demonstrating dignity to the other person, not letting them off the hook. But sometimes we walk into these sorts of performance conversations with assumptions in our mind that aren't necessarily correct. So spend enough time finding out what the source of the problem is. Okay, so there are a few tips for you, and I hope that you can take those away with you and perhaps perhaps use them in your own way. What I want to just mention here is that next week we're going to talk about improving engagement through feedback, coming out of my book, Mastering Feedback, a practical guide to better leadership conversations. So we're going to do a little bit of discussion about, we're going to elaborate a little bit on the relationship between engagement and feedback. You can see that it's next Friday at 10 a.m. It's always at the same time, Australian Eastern Standard Time. There's a link there on the slide. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides, and I'll also be sending you the recording as well. Yes, just had a comment there from, Glenn. I will be sending you an email today and it'll have the link, so you'll get all that. No worries. Now, the other thing I would say just before I finish up today is, here we go. Now, if you'd like to pre-order a copy of my book, I am giving you the opportunity to do that at half price. Now, the book will be out in the next month, probably 4 to 6 weeks. And what I'm offering you is an opportunity to purchase that by pre-ordering at half price. And I'll sign the book for you and send it out to you. And in order to take advantage of that, all you need to do is send me an email by the close of business today. And I'll be more than happy to put you on the list, and I'll correspond with you. And when the book's available, you'll be the first one to get a copy. All right, so folks, thank you. I'll just close it out there. I noticed my webcam's not working, unfortunately, but never mind. I'd just like to say thank you. Look forward to the opportunity of seeing you in future webinars, and thank you very much for participating. And I hope you found some of those tips and hints valuable in terms of your own ways of dealing with feedback. Thanks, everyone. All the best, and have a wonderful year, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you and goodbye.